Just wanted to make sure that my do not disturb was on. And I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to get in here. I'm having a lot of pain today, but I won't talk about that right now. Okay. I'm in a lot of pain today, but I won't talk about that right now. All right. Let me pop out the chat. All righty. Hey, Linda Bob, Kathy Ponder. Hi. How's it going? I'm having a lot of problem with my back and my legs. Has been for a week or so, but my knees are really wreaking havoc. So it took me a few extra minutes to get here today from the kitchen when I made my tea. So I'll give a few minutes for more folks to come in because it's, well, I am a bit late. I'm 3 minutes late. Hi. Hey, Kate Martin. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I also have these pre-recorded on in playlists, eh? But this is just the live reading to so we can have some. Yeah, look at my hair all over the place. All right, shall we begin? I've got to change my glasses. Got to change my glasses for reading. Okay, there we go. Now I can't see you guys. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I have read all the Little House on the Prairie books, the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And every one of them is in a playlist on this channel. Okay. We are reading, this is Little House Live, Day 8. We are reading On the Banks of Plum Creek, Chapter 20, School. Monday morning came. As soon as Laura and Mary had washed the breakfast dishes, they went up the ladder and put on their Sunday dresses. Mary's was a blue sprigged calico and Laura's was red sprigged. Ma braided their hair very tightly and bound the ends with thread. They could not wear their Sunday hair ribbons because they might lose them. They put on their sunbonnets, freshly washed and ironed. Then Ma took them into the bedroom. She knelt down by the box where she kept her best things, and she took out 3 books. They were the books she had studied when she was a little girl. One was a speller, one was a reader, and one was arithmetic. She looked solemnly at Mary and Laura, and they were solemn too. I am giving you these books for your very own, Mary and Laura. I know you will take care of them and study faithfully. Yes, Ma, they said. She gave Mary the books to carry. She gave Laura the little tin pail with their lunch in it under a clean cloth. Goodbye. Be good, girls. Ma and Carrie stood in the doorway, and Jack went with them down the knoll. He was puzzled. They went across the grass where the tracks of Pa wagon wheels went, and Jack stayed close beside Laura. When they came to the ford of the creek, he sat down and whined anxiously. Laura had to explain to him that he must not come any farther. She stroked his big head and tried to smooth out the worried wrinkles. But he just sat watching and frowning while they waded across the shallow, wide ford. They waded carefully and did not splash their clean dresses. A blue heron rose from the water, flapping away with his long legs dangling. Laura and Mary stepped carefully onto the grass. They would not walk in the dusty wheel tracks until their feet were dry, because their feet must be clean when they come to town. The new house looked small on its knoll, with the great green prairie spreading far around it. Ma and Carrie had gone inside. Only Jack sat watching by the ford. Mary and Laura walked on quietly. Dew was sparkling on the grass. Meadow larks were singing. Snipes were walking on their long, thin legs. Prairie hens were clucking and tiny prairie chicks were peeping. Rabbits stood up with their paws dangling, long ears twitching, and their round eyes staring at Mary and Laura. Pa had said that town was only 2.5 miles away, and the road would take them to it. They would know they were in town when they came to a house. You know you're in town when you come to a house. Large white clouds sailed in the enormous sky, and their gray shadows trailed across the waving prairie grasses. The road always ended a little way ahead, but when they came to that ending, the road was going on. It was only the tracks of Pa's wagon through the grass. For pity's sake, Laura, said Mary, keep your sunbonnet on. You'll be as brown as an Indian, and what will the town girls think of us? I don't care, said Laura loudly and bravely. You do too. I don't either, said Laura. You do? I don't. You're just as scared of town as I am, said Mary. Laura did not answer. After a while, she took hold of her sunbonnet strings and pulled the bonnet up over her head. Anyway, there's 2 of us, Mary said. They went on and on. After a long time, they saw town. It looked like small blocks of wood on the prairie. When the road dipped down, they saw only grasses and sky again. Then they saw the town again, always larger. Smoke went up from its stovepipes. The clean grassy road ended in dust. This dusty road went by a small house and then past a store. The store had a porch with steps going up to it. Beyond the store, there was a blacksmith shop. It stood back from the road with a bare place in front of it. Inside, a big man in a leather apron made the bellows puff, puff at red coals. He took a white-hot iron out of the coals with tongs and swung a big hammer down on it. Whang! Dozens of sparks flew out into the daylight. Flew out tiny in the daylight. Beyond the bare place was the back of a building. Mary and Laura walked close to the side of this building. The ground was hard there. There was no more grass to walk on. In front of this building, another wide, dusty road crossed their road. Mary and Laura stopped. They looked across the dust at the fronts of 2 more stores. They heard the confused noise of children's voices. Pa's road did not go any further. Come on, Mary said low, but she stood still. It's the school where we hear the hollering. Pa said we would hear it. Laura wanted to turn around and run all the way home. She and Mary were slowly walking out into the dust and turned toward that noise of voices. They went padding along between 2 stores. They passed piles of boards and shingles. That must be the lumber yard where Pa got the boards for the new house. Then they saw the schoolhouse. It was out on the prairie beyond the end of the dusty road. A long path went toward it through the grass. Boys and girls were in front of it. Excuse me. Sorry. Laura went along the path toward them, and Mary came behind her. All those girls and boys stopped their noise and looked. Laura kept on going nearer and nearer, all those eyes, and suddenly, without meaning to, she swung the dinner pail and called out, "You all sounded just like a flock of prairie chickens." They were surprised, but they were not as much surprised as Laura. She was ashamed, too. Mary gasped, "Laura." Then a freckled boy with fire-colored hair yelled, "Snipes! Yourselves, Snipes! Long-legged Snipes!" Laura wanted to sink down and hide her legs. Her dress was too short. It was much shorter than the townsgirls' dresses. So was Mary's. Before they came to Plum Creek, Ma said they were outgrowing those dresses. Their bare legs did look long and spindly like Snipes' legs. All the boys were pointing and yelling, "Snipes! Snipes!" Then a red-headed girl began pushing those boys and saying, "Shut up. You make too much noise. Shut up, Sandy," she said to the red-headed boy, and then he shut up. She came close to Laura and said, My name's Christy Kennedy, and that horrid boy is my brother Sandy. But he doesn't mean any harm. What's your name? Her red hair was braided so tightly that the braids were stiff. Her eyes were dark blue, almost black, and her round cheeks were freckled. Her sunbonnet hung down her back. Is that your sister? She said. Those are my sisters. Some big girls were talking to Mary. The big one's Nettie, and the black-haired one's Cassie, and then there's Donald, me, and Sandy. How many brothers and sisters have you? 2, Laura said. That's Mary, and Carrie's the baby. She has golden hair, too. And we have a bulldog named Jack. We live on Plum Creek. Where do you live? Does your pa drive 2 bay horses with black manes and tails? Christy asked. Yes, said Laura. They're Sam and David. Our Christmas horses. He comes by your house, so you came by it. Oh, he comes by our house, so you came by it too, said Christy. It's the house before you came to the Beatles store and post office. Before you get to the blacksmith shop. Miss Eva Beatles, our teacher. That's Nellie Oleson. Nellie Oleson was very pretty. Her yellow hair hung in long curls with 2 big blue ribbon bows on top. Her dress was thin white lawn with little blue flowers scattered over it, and she wore shoes. She looked at Laura and she looked at Mary, and she wrinkled up her nose. She said, country girls. That's sweetgrass I have growing. I have sweetgrass. Oh, I'm going to have to tell Howie, because he said he smelled something really sweet, and he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I just got a whiff. We've got sweetgrass out there. Before anyone else could say anything, a bell rang. A young lady stood in the schoolhouse doorway, swinging the bell in her hand. All the boys and girls hurried by her into the schoolhouse. She was a beautiful young lady. Her brown hair was frizzed in bangs over her brown eyes and done in thick braids behind. Buttons sparkled all down the front of her bodice, and her skirts were drawn back tightly and fell down behind in big puffs and loops. Her face was sweet and her smile was lovely. She laid her hand on Laura's shoulder and said, You're a new little girl, aren't you? Yes, ma'am, said Laura. And is this your sister? Teacher asked, smiling at Mary. Yes, ma'am, said Mary. Then come with me, said Teacher, and I'll write your names in my book. They went with her the whole length of the schoolhouse and stepped up on the platform. The schoolhouse was a room made of new boards. Its ceiling was the underneath of shingles, and its ceiling was the underneath of shingles like the attic ceiling. Long benches stood, one behind the other, down the middle of the room. They were made of plain boards. Each bench had a back and 2 shelves stuck out from the back, over the bench behind. Only the front bench did not have any shelves in front of it, and the last bench did not have any back. There were 2 glass windows in each side of the schoolhouse. They were open, and so was the door. The wind came in, and the sound of the waving grasses, and the smell and the sight of the endless prairie, and the great light of the sky. Laura saw all this while she stood with Mary by Teacher's desk, and they told her names and how old they were. She did not move her head, but her eyes looked around. A water pail, oh my goodness. A water pail stood on a bench by the door. A bottom broom stood in the corner. On the wall behind Teacher's desk was a smooth space of boards painted black. Under it was a little trough. Some kind of short white sticks lay in the trough, and a block of wood with a woolly bit of sheepskin pulled tightly around it and nailed down. Laura wondered what those things were. Mary showed Teacher how much she could read and spell, but Laura looked at Ma's book and shook her head. She could not read. She was not even sure of all the letters. Well, you can begin at the beginning, Laura, said Teacher, and Mary can study farther on. Have you a slate? They did not have a slate. I will lend you mine. You cannot learn to write without a slate." She lifted up the top of her desk and took out the slate. The desk was made like a tall box with one side cut out for her knees. The top rose up on button hinges, and under it was a place where she kept things. Her books were there, and the ruler. Laura did not know until later that the ruler was to punish anyone who fidgeted or whispered in school. Anyone who was so naughty had to walk up to the teacher's desk and hold out her hand while teacher slapped it many times hard with the ruler. But Laura and Mary never whispered in school, and they always tried not to fidget. They sat side by side on a bench and studied. Mary's feet rested on the floor, but Laura's dangled. They held their book open on the board shelf before them, and Laura studying at the front of the book and Mary studying further on. And the pages between standing straight up. The pages between standing straight up. Laura was a whole class by herself because she was the only pupil who could not read. Whenever teacher had time, she called Laura to her desk and helped her read her letters. Just before dinner time that first day, Laura was able to read cat, C-A-T. Suddenly, she remembered and said, P-A-T, Pat. Teacher was surprised. R-A-T, rat, said teacher. M-A-T, Matt. And Laura was reading. She could read the whole first row in the speller. At noon, all the children and teacher went home to dinner. Laura and Mary took their dinner pail and sat in the grass against the shady side of the empty schoolhouse. They ate their bread and butter and talked. "I like school," said Mary. "So do I," said Laura. "Only it makes my legs tired. But I don't like that Nellie Oleson that called us country girls." "We are country girls," said Mary. Yes, and she needn't wrinkle her nose," Laura said. "What's going on?" "Oh, well, thank you, Leah. What's going on?" All right. Shall we read chapter 21, Nellie Oleson? We may actually get through more than one Little House book this summer if we keep reading 2 or 3 chapters a night, eh? Sorry, guys. I need to wet my whistle. All right. Chapter 21, Nellie Oleson. Jack was waiting to meet them at the ford that night, and at supper they told Pa and Ma all about school. When they said they were using the teacher's slate, Pa shook his head. They must not be beholden for the loan of a slate. Next morning he took his money out of the fiddle box and counted it. He gave Mary a round silver piece to buy a slate. "There's plenty of fish in the creek," he said. "We'll hold out till the wheat harvest." "There'll be potatoes pretty soon, too," said Ma. She tied the money in a handkerchief and pinned it inside Mary's pocket. Mary clutched that pocket all the way along the prairie road. The wind was blowing. Butterflies and birds were flying over the waving grasses and wild flowers. The rabbits loped before the wind, and the great clear sky curved over it all. Laura swung the dinner pail and hippity-hopped. In town, they crossed the dusty main street and climbed the steps to Mr. Olson's store. Pa had said to buy the slate there. Inside the store, there was a long board counter. The wall behind it was covered with shelves full of tin pans and pots and lamps and lanterns and bolts of colored cloth. By the other wall stood plows and kegs of nails and rolls of wire. And on that wall hung saws and hammers and hatchets and knives. A large, round, yellow cheese was on the counter, and on the floor in front of it was a barrel of molasses and a whole keg of pickles, and a big wooden box full of crackers, and 2 tall wooden pails of candy. It was Christmas candy, 2 big pails of it. Suddenly, the back door of the store burst open, and Nellie Oleson and her little brother Willie came bouncing in. Did you know that in the TV series, Melissa Gilbert, the guy who played Willie, was her actual brother in real life? Nellie's nose wrinkled at Laura and Mary, and Willie yelled at them, "Yeah, long-legged snipes." "Shut up, Willie," Mr. Oleson said, but Willie did not shut up. He went on saying, "Snipes, snipes." Nellie flounced by Mary and Laura and dug her hands into a pail of candy, while Willie dug into the other pail. They grabbed all the candy they could hold and stood cramming it into their mouths. They stood in front of Mary and Laura looking at them and did not offer them even one piece. "Nellie, you and Willie go right back out of here," Mr. Oleson said. They went on stuffing candy into their mouths and staring at Mary and Laura. Mr. Oleson took no more notice of them. That was the problem, right? Mary gave him the money and he gave her the slate. He said, "You'll want a slate pencil too. Here it is, 1 penny. Nellie said, "They haven't got a penny." "Well, take it along then and tell your pa to give me the penny the next time he comes to town," said Mr. Oleson. "No, sir, thank you," Mary said. She turned around and so did Laura, and they walked back out of the store. At the door, Laura looked back and Nellie made a face at her. Nellie's tongue was streaked with red and green from the candy. "My goodness," Mary said. "I couldn't be as mean as that Nellie Oleson." Laura thought, I could be meaner to her than she is to me if Pa and Ma would let me. They looked at their slate's smooth, soft gray surface and its clean, flat wooden frame, cunningly fitted together at the corners. It was a handsome slate, but they must have a slate pencil. Pa had already spent so much for the slate, and they hated to tell him they must have another penny. They walked along soberly till suddenly Laura remembered their Christmas pennies. They still had those pennies that they had found in their stockings on Christmas morning in Indian Territory. Mary had a penny and Laura had a penny, but they needed only one slate. They needed only one slate pencil. So they decided that Mary would spend her penny for the pencil, and after that she would own half of Laura's penny. Next morning they bought the pencil, but they did not buy it from Mr. Oleson. They bought it at Mr. Beadle's store and post office, where the teacher lived. And that morning they walked on to school with teacher. All through the long, hot weeks they went to school, and every day they liked it more. They liked reading and writing and arithmetic. They liked spelling down on Friday afternoons, and Laura loved recess, when the little girls rushed out into the sun and the wind picking wildflowers among the prairie grasses and playing games. The boys played boys' games on one side of the schoolhouse, and the girls played girls' games on the other side. Mary sat with the other big girls, ladylike, on the steps. The little girls always played Ring Around a Rosie because Nellie Oleson said to. They got tired of it, but they always played it till one day before Nellie could say anything. Laura said, "Let's play Uncle John." Let's, the girl said, taking hold of hands. But Nellie grabbed both hands full of Laura's long hair and jerked her flat to the ground. No, Nellie shouted. "I want to play Ring Around the Rosie." Laura jumped up and her hand flashed out to slap Nellie. She stopped just in time. Pa said she must never strike anybody. "Come on, Laura," Christy said. Taking her hand, Laura's face felt like bursting, and she could hardly see, but she went circling with the others around Nellie. Nellie tossed her curls and flounced her skirts because she had got her way. Then Christy began singing, and all the others joined in. "Uncle John is sick abed. What shall we sing it? What shall we send him?" No, Ring Around a Rosie," Nellie screamed, "or I won't play." She broke through the ring, and no one went after her. "All right, you get in the middle, Maud," Christy said, and they began over. "Uncle John is sick abed. What shall we bring him?" What shall we send him? A piece of pie, a piece of cake, apple, and dumpling. What shall we send it in? A golden saucer. Who shall we send it by? The governor's daughter. If the governor's daughter ain't at home, who shall we send it by? And all the girls shouted, By Laura Ingalls! Laura stepped into the middle of the ring, and they danced around her. They went on playing Uncle John till teacher rang the bell. Nellie was in the schoolhouse crying, and she said she was so mad that she thought she was never going to speak to Laura or Christy again. But next week, she asked all the girls to a party at her house on Saturday afternoon. She asked Christy and Laura specially. Well, who wants to go on to 23? We seem to be making our 22, the town party. Ring around the rosy. Do you know that most of those children's things were associated with death? Ring around the rosy. Does anybody know what that's about? Pockets full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That's a plague reference. You know, putting posies in the pocket full of posies to keep the stink down. All right. Chapter 22, Town Party. Laura and Mary had never been to a party and did not know quite what it would be like. Ma said it was a pleasant time that friends had together. After school on Friday, she washed their dresses and sunbonnets. Saturday morning, she ironed them fresh and crisp. Laura and Mary bathed that morning, too, instead of that night. You look sweet and pretty as posies, Ma said when they came down the ladder dressed for the party. She tied on their hair ribbons and warned them not to lose them. Now be good girls, she said. Mind your manners. When they came to town, they stopped for Cassie and Christy. Cassie and Christy had never been to a party either. They all went timidly into Mr. Oleson's store, and Mr. Oleson told them, Go right on in. So they went past the candy and the pickles and the plows to the back door of the store. It opened, and there stood Nellie, all dressed up, and Mrs. Oleson asking them in. Laura had never seen such a fine room. She could hardly say good afternoon, Mrs. Oleson, and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. The whole floor was covered with some kind of heavy cloth that felt rough under Laura's bare feet. It was brown and green with red and yellow scrolls all over it. The walls and the ceiling were narrow, smooth boards fitted together with a crease between them. The table and chairs were of a yellow wood that shone like glass, and their legs were perfectly round. There were colored pictures on the walls. Go into the bedroom, girls, and leave your bonnets, said Mrs. Oleson in a company voice. The bedstead was shiny wood, too. There were two other pieces of furniture. One was made of drawers on top of each other with two little drawers sitting on its top, and two little curved pieces of wood went up and held a big looking glass between them. On top of the other stood a china pitcher in a china bowl, and a small dish with a piece of soap in it. There were glass windows in both rooms, and the curtains of those windows were white lace. Behind the front room was a big lean-to with a cook stove in it, like Ma's new one, and had all kinds of tin pots and pans hanging on the walls. All the girls were there now, and Mrs. Oleson's skirts went rustling among them. Laura wanted to be still and look at things, but Mrs. Oleson said, Now, Nellie, bring out your playthings. They can play with Willie's playthings, Nellie said. They can't ride on my velocipede. I hope I said that correctly. Velocipede, Willie shouted. Well, they can play with your Noah's Ark and your soldier, said Nellie, and Mrs. Oleson made Willie be quiet. What are we hearing? What are we feeling about Nellie and Willie's parents? They never correct the children, even when the father tries and they ignore him. There's no consequences, right? The Noah's Ark was the most wonderful thing that Laura had ever seen. They all knelt down and squealed and shouted and laughed over it. There were zebras and elephants and tigers and horses, all kinds of animals, just as if the picture had come out of the paper-covered Bible at home. There were 2 whole armies of tin soldiers with uniforms painted bright blue and bright red. There was a jumping jack. He was cut out of thin, flat wood. Striped paper trousers and jacket were pasted on him, and his face was painted white with red cheeks and circles around his eyes. And his tall cap was pointed. He hung between 2 thin red strips of wood. When you squeezed them, he danced. His hands held onto the twisted strings. He would turn a somersault over the strings. He would stand on his head with his toe on his nose. Even the big girls were chattering and squealing over those animals and those soldiers, and they laughed at the jumping jack till they cried. Then Nellie walked among them and said, "You can look at my doll." The doll had a china head with smooth red cheeks. If you notice, they've got Laura wearing shoes, but they went barefoot. Her eyes were black, and her china hair was black and waved. Her wee hands were china, and her feet were tiny china feet in black china slippers. "Oh," said Laura. "Oh, what a beautiful doll. Oh, Nellie, what's her name?" "She's nothing but an old doll," Nellie said. "I don't care about this old doll. You wait till you see my wax doll." She threw the china doll, in a drawer, and then she took out a long box. She put the box on the bed, and she took off its lid. All the girls leaned around her to look. There lay a doll that seemed to be alive. Real golden hair lay in soft curls on her little pillow. Her lips were parted, showing 2 tiny white teeth. Her eyes were closed. The doll was sleeping there in the box. Nellie lifted her up, and her eyes opened wide, and they were big blue eyes, and she seemed to laugh. Her arms stretched out, and she said, "Mama." "She does that when I squeeze her stomach," Nellie said. She punched the doll's stomach hard with her fist, and the poor doll cried out, "Mama!" She was dressed in blue silk. Her petticoats were real petticoats trimmed with ruffles and lace, and her panties were real little panties that could come off. On her feet were real little blue leather slippers. All this time Laura had not said a word. She couldn't. She did not think of actually touching that marvelous doll. But without meaning to, her finger reached out towards the blue silk. "Don't you touch her!" screeched Nellie. "You keep your hands off my doll, Laura Ingalls." She snatched the doll against her and turned her back to Laura so she could not see her putting her back in the box. Laura's face burned hot, and the other girls did not know what to do. Laura went and sat on a chair. The others watched Nellie put the box in a drawer and shut it. Then they looked at the animals and the soldiers again and squeezed the jumping jack. Mrs. Oleson came in and asked Laura why she was not playing. Laura said, "I would rather sit here, thank you, ma'am." "Would you like to look at one of these?" Mrs. Oleson asked her, and she laid 2 books in Laura's lap. "Thank you, ma'am," Laura said. She turned the pages of the books carefully. One was not exactly a book. It was thin, and it had no covers. It was a little magazine, all for children. The other book was thick, with a thick, glossy cover, and on the cover was a picture of an old woman wearing a peaked cap and riding on a broom across a huge yellow moon. Over her head, large letters said, "Mother Goose." Laura had not known there were such wonderful books in the world. On every page of that book, there was a picture and a rhyme. Laura could read some of them. She forgot all about the party. Suddenly, Mrs. Oleson was saying, "Come, little girl, you mustn't let the others eat all the cake, must you?" "Yes, ma'am," Laura said. "No, ma'am." A glossy white cloth covered the table. On it was a beautiful white cake, a sugar white cake, and tall glasses. "I got the biggest piece," Nellie shouted, grabbing a piece out of the cake. The others sat waiting until Miss Oleson gave them their pieces. She put each piece on a china plate. Is your lemonade sweet enough? Mrs. Oleson asked. So Laura knew that it was lemonade in the glasses. She had never tasted anything like it. At first it was sweet, but after she ate a bit of sugar white off the piece of cake, the lemonade was sour. But they all answered Mrs. Oleson politely. Yes, thank you, ma'am. They were careful not to let a crumb of cake fall on the tablecloth. They did not spill one drop of lemonade. Then it was time to go home. And Laura remembered to say, as Ma had told them to, Thank you, Mrs. Oleson. I had a very good time at the party. So did all the others. When they were out of the store, Christy said to Laura, I wish you'd slap that mean Nellie Oleson. Oh, no, I couldn't, Laura said. But I'm going to get even with her. Shh, don't let Mary know I said that. Jack was waiting lonesome at the ford. It was Saturday, and Laura had not played with him. It would be a whole week before they could have another day of playing along Plum Creek. They told Ma all about the party, and she said, We must not accept hospitality without making some return. I've been thinking about it, girls. You must ask Nellie Oleson and the others to a party here. I think a week from Saturday. Now, if my children acted that spoiled and treated other children that abominably, they wouldn't have had a party after the stunt of eating, just digging into the candy and shoving it into their faces and not listening to their father and all that stuff. I'm sorry, but these people spared the rod and spoiled the child, if you ask me. So, thank you for joining me for Little House Life. Another 3 chapters underway. Next week, we're going to read The Country Party. So, we'll see you then. I love you guys. And, Nellie and Willie were perfect little monsters. You're quite welcome. For those of you who don't know it, there is playlists. All you have to do is search them. There's playlists. I have playlists for every book that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote. From Little House in the Big Woods all the way up to the journey. I believe it's called The Journey Home, after her first 4 years with Almanzo. Right? I love you guys. Take care. God bless. And for those of you who are on Life with the Wolfies, we'll see you at 8 o'clock for our live stream, our public live stream. All right? Take care. God bless. Mwah! See you next week.